Welcome to the UST Education recorded webinar series. This session is powered by US Transactions. UST is a boutique payment processing firm providing you with personalized service. We offer agnostic, best fit technology solutions for associations, nonprofits, and enterprise clients.
This is great. Hi, everybody. Mark Franco. I'm a partner at the Ramon Law Firm. I've been working with nonprofit tax-exempt organizations since 2003, so a little over 20 years now. In my role at Ramon Law, I usually serve as outside general counsel to a number of nonprofit organizations. I'm very active in the ASAE community, so if you ever run into me or if you ever need a resource, please feel free to reach out, and my contact information will be at the end of this presentation. So I see all of these really great goals for today, and I thought I'd just also recap what I thought might make a good goal also for us today. So we're going to look at 10 core nonprofit director duties and rules, and we're going to take them out of the boardroom and apply them to our daily personal decision making. And you may think, well, why would director duties, why would that make sense for just the everyday rules and activities that we have to do? Well, that's because these duties have been, they've been crafted to really reflect broader expectations about judgment, fairness, and integrity. And who doesn't need more of that, right? In the things that we do on a daily basis. I'm a big follower of the news. I like to have all kinds of discussions with colleagues, with friends. And I've actually used, after learning about these duties, I've actually used some of these duties in my own decision making. And that's how this session came about. I figured it gives pretty much a very simple, structured framework for somebody who wants to take one or two things out of the boardroom and apply them to their personal life. So let's jump right into it, okay? Rule number one. Rule number one is the duty of care. So when you hear the duty of care, it's really about making informed decision making. And let me just preface by saying today is going to be more of an application of these duties to personal decision making. We're not going to go really in depth about the specific duties and rules. And I have another presentation on that and would be happy to talk to any of you at another time about those specifics. But really, it's just going to be a high-level review of those duties and rules because I want us to figure out how we can use them in other ways. Right, so like I said, the duty of care, it's really about informed decision making. And so what does that mean for us on an everyday basis? Well, it's taking the time to understand a situation. Now, in my practice, I write a lot of emails, and how many of you know somebody who likes to hit send right after they write their email? Well, for me, it's usually reading an email that I've received at least 2 or 3 times, and then reading my response at least 2 or 3 times, because I want to be very thoughtful about how I'm going to reply to that specific situation. The other thing about making informed decision making is you need information from reliable sources. My daughter, she's 14, she loves to ask me questions about things that she's learned over TikTok, right? Hey, Dad, did so-and-so, did they actually do this? Or did this actually happen? And of course, I have to say, honey, it's TikTok. You might want to look for another source to verify the information that you're getting. The other thing we want to remember when it comes to the duty of care is no impulse decisions in important situations, right? I mean, there's many times I could point to when I was younger when I did not follow this at all. Now, I'm not saying that you need to apply this duty of care to every single thing that you're doing, right? That's not the point of today, right? I'm not here to preach, and I don't want to make things so onerous that you're going to find it hard to start making decisions outside of the boardroom. That's certainly not the case. But what I want to do is try and bring back some thoughtfulness to how we might approach decision making in our personal lives. So rule 2 is the duty of loyalty. And when it comes to nonprofits, the duty of loyalty is to act in the best interest of the organization. Well, how do we apply that if we're trying to act in the best interest of the organization? How would we apply that in our own everyday application? Well, the first thing I've written here is create goals that focus on benefit to those around you, like your family. In the legal profession, and I'm sure this is the case in many other professions, there's sometimes a pressure to make sacrifices of family, sacrifices of free time, sacrifices of the quality of life for you to be able to, climb up the ladder or get a client or do something else that might benefit you personally. And I would encourage you to use those opportunities and think, what is the impact, not just to you, but to those around you, right? What might sound like something that's really good for you may have a bunch of other implications that wouldn't be, they just wouldn't be good for the people surrounding you. And is that ultimately what you want to do in that situation? Well, if you're following something like a duty of loyalty, then you might think about what's the collective interest? And is that more important in that situation versus my own personal interest? The other thing you can do when it comes to the duty of loyalty is you can be transparent to those around you. So if you have a chance at promotion, or if you have the chance at getting a new client, talk it over with maybe your colleagues that might have to help you with that client, or your family that might have to, deal with the outcomes of getting that promotion. So let's move on to rule 3. Rule 3 is the duty of obedience. And this one really gets in the boardroom, this one really gets confused, because when people hear the term obedience, they think that it's to follow the organization regardless of what their own personal opinion might be. And potentially also regardless of whether it's good or bad, right, for the organization itself. But what the duty of obedience really means is that you want to respect the organization's mission and its policies. Okay, so you're probably asking, Mark, well, what does this have to do with everyday application? We don't have a mission and we don't have policies. But what we do have, and what we should have, is a set of non-negotiable principles, right? what are those rules that you live by? You know, for me, it's, I grew up Catholic, and I was taught the Ten Commandments. And it's not like I followed the Ten Commandments on a daily basis, but one thing that I learned from growing up with religious principles is that, you've probably heard it, it's the golden rule. And the golden rule is to treat others as you would like to be treated. And that's something that I do try and live by on a daily basis. The other rule that I use personally, that's a non-negotiable rule, is that I want to be a resource to everybody around me, to my family, to my colleagues, to clients, even to folks that I don't know, right? Which is why I enjoy doing these types of webinars. If I can help you in what you do in your professional activities or in your personal activities, these are, these are things that I want. This is how I want to live. These are principles that I want to live by. And the other thing about having non-negotiable principles is you need to adhere to them even when it's difficult. Right? It's not easy to put together a webinar, right? It's not easy to be there for your friend when you're busy, but you want to try and do these things even when it's difficult. And I'd love to hear in chat, what are some of your own non-negotiable principles that you use? So Judy said, respect, honesty. That's great. Amanda, integrity. Yeah, Amy's assume positive intent. That's awesome. Laura, respect and transparency. Chris, kindness. So these are really great. And the other thing that I hope you're able to take away from today is, these are some of these things that I try and instill in my own daughter. And I would hope that maybe some of this presentation gives you a way to show to others, like how simple it is just to have certain things that will assist you in your daily life and your daily decision making. A simple structure that could be one or two of these rules that would really, really make a difference, right, in how they approach any particular situation. So rule 4. Rule 4 is the business judgment rule. And what the business judgment rule says with respect to nonprofit organizations and general business decisions is that if you're making a decision in good faith, you're not generally going to be liable. So what does that mean for us? Well, let's say that we've approached a situation well informed, that we're honoring the purpose for why we want to make a decision, and that we're being considerate of all of those around us when it comes to that particular decision. Then it's okay. If you make a decision and it doesn't quite work out, it's okay to move on without regret, right? Raise your hand in the chat or shout out if you find yourself sort of constantly second guessing or even not potentially making any decisions because you're afraid to make a mistake, or you're afraid that there's just too much risk when it comes to that particular decision. I find myself doing this all the time, and it's more about, for me, being an attorney, I've come to understand that there's always going to be an amount of risk, and that we see that there's this reasonable risk. But the one thing that I've really had to learn is to make mistakes without regret, to continue to look forward instead of to look back. I think if we can do this more, we'll really, we'll really improve our own particular situations. And I love all the, all of the raised hands in chat. Nisha says, I tend to hem and haw over minor things. Yeah, that's I know quite a few people who do that. And feel free if you have any questions while we're going on, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. I'll try to get to them, or maybe Sarah can help answer those if I don't happen to get to them or bring them to my attention. Okay, so just to recap, we've had 3 duties already: duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience, and then we've also had the business judgment rule. So 4 rules so far. Rule number 5, conflicts of interest. Okay, conflicts of interest, when it comes to nonprofits, it means there's potentially a competing personal and organizational interest. Right? Well, how does it come up in everyday situations? Well, it's really trying to be extra sensitive to decisions that affect those around you. So I've already talked about potential situations where you might have a promotion that is going to be great for you, but will it mean time away from your family? Will it mean not being able to do things that you would typically do for friends or for colleagues? One example I can give is when I was in law school. So I was working full time, went to law school part time, and just as an aside, if you're thinking about law school, go full time. Don't do part time. It's the worst decision that you're ever going to make. For me, part-time, it was around 10 to 12 credits a semester. So imagine trying to accomplish 10 to 12 credits. And in law school, the way that you learn is both in the classroom and then also reading text and case law. And we would usually get about 50 pages of text a class, and then maybe 3 or 4 cases. So this is on top of working a full-time job. And in addition to that, you have to go 4 years instead of 3 years. So part-time law school, don't do it. Okay, that might be like rule 12 or 13 that you get out of this. But in law school, getting back to the everyday situation, in law school, there is simply not enough time for me to do anything else around the house. And my wonderful wife recognized that. So she took up all that extra slack. But when we were thinking about me going to law school, that's a discussion that we had. Okay, what are going to be the conflicting interests here, right? It's the need to potentially change a career versus how is that going to affect the family? Okay. The other thing when it comes to personal conflicts of interest, recognize your own bias, right? What is it that's motivating you, and what is it that potentially is motivating the other interests that might be affecting your decision? And then try to be aware when serving in dual roles. So going back to my law school example, it's the professional versus the family person. Okay. If we're a little bit more thoughtful about all of the conflicts and competing interests that we might have in our daily activities, maybe we'll have better outcomes. But at least it'll be good practice for when it's time for you to serve on that board. All right, rule number 6. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this rule because, in my experience, this is really the most important rule when it comes not just to serving in a board, but conducting yourself with your friends, family, and colleagues. Okay. And I see this rule broken all the time in every possible type of situation. And if you have seen this if you've had this happen to you, please feel free to vent right now in chat. The rule of confidentiality. So when it comes to serving on a board, okay, you're usually going to have a confidentiality policy that applies, and you may even have to sign an agreement that will hold you to very strict confidentiality rules. But absent that, okay, absent policy and absent any agreement, please, 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 okay, strictly protect information that is shared with you. All right, particularly if it's personal information. And if you don't know if it's personal information, then don't disclose it. I cannot encourage this enough. Okay, I've had this happen both professionally and personally, and I've never been able to approach that particular person in the same way. Okay, that is how much, yes, Alicia, it's so hard to trust anybody that violates this particular rule. It's so hard to trust them, and that is a huge, huge detriment to your ability to interact with that person. Okay, if you're teaching your children, please, I hope this is one of the things that you teach them. Okay, hold that personal information, hold that trust that somebody has instilled in you, hold it very close and try your best not to violate it. Okay, hopefully this is one of the non-negotiable principles that we are choosing to live by. Brenda, 100%. I love it. Okay, rule 7. So rule 7 is kind of it's an awkward one to apply to everyday life. But with respect to nonprofit organizations, rule 7 is private inurement, and it's really related to not creating personal gain from the collective activities of the organization. So when I was trying to think of a scenario, when I was trying to think of a scenario for this, it was really hard. It was really hard to come up with one. But when I think of private inurement, I always go back to the analogy of team sports and how there's always this competing narrative of somebody trying to be the person that is all about themselves, and somebody that understands their role in the team, and that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to do things that benefit the team, whereas the person that's interested in personal stats, that's what they're doing, is they're trying to they're trying to pad their personal stats. I don't know if you've seen there's a video of Shaquille O'Neal talking about Kobe Bryant. And this was after Kobe had passed away and they were giving tribute. And it was a really funny story that Shaq had about Kobe. And, this might not come up in our everyday lives, but I think it's a funny example. So Shaq was talking about this particular game where Kobe was just being, he was being the best of himself in every way. So he was making all the shots. He was, had the ball in his hands constantly. And after the game, some of Kobe and Shaq's teammates came up to Shaq and they're like, Shaq, we really love winning, right? But we just wish that Kobe would pass the ball more, right? And so Shaq, being one of the leaders with Kobe, he goes to Kobe and he says, Kobe, I'm hearing from the rest of the guys that we really, they'd love it if you could just share the ball more, and if I could politely remind you, and I'm sanitizing what Shaq said. He said it in a much more colorful way. He said, "Can I just remind you that there's no I in team?" And you know what Kobe said? Kobe said, "Well, there might not be an I in team, but there is an ME." All right, and so that just shows you, as great of a player Kobe was, he was in some cases sometimes all about making himself be the best that he could, and not that there was anything wrong with that, but maybe there's times where we could just be a little bit more mindful of of of, of our collective benefit rather than doing it for ourselves. All right, rule 8. So rule 8 is to use experts. And this is one that I've had to learn myself over a number of years. So when it comes to nonprofit organizations, if you think about who the directors are, right? They're volunteers that may have come from the profession. They might be a public member, so not necessarily part of the profession, but they're not folks that potentially have served in governance roles before. And that's okay, right? Public policy in the US is very favorable to having volunteers serve on a board of directors, particularly nonprofit board of directors. But who really gets experience when it comes to serving on a nonprofit board? Most of us don't, unless you maybe were part of your local parent-teacher organization, or you maybe happen to serve in one of the nonprofit sports leagues for your kids. So, we need to recognize, both when we're on a board and even when we're just trying to do things for ourselves and our families and our colleagues, we don't have all the answers, right? So we should, as much as we can, learn to utilize other people's expertise and perspective. One thing that I like to tell potential law school applicants when they come to me for advice is I say, look, you have to talk to as many people as possible related to the decision that you want to make. So if you're interested in applying to law school, talk to people that are in law school right now. Talk to lawyers that have gone through law school and maybe doing the things that you want to do once you graduate. talk to faculty at any particular law school you want to go to. Talk to your friends and family. Ask them if if they think you might be a good lawyer, right? Try and get as much perspective, particularly from those people that have the expertise that's relevant, so that you can make that duty of care informed decision, right? Recognize that there's lots of people, who can assist in that way, right? And I'd love to see in the chat who's using a personal board of advisors. I mean, I know I have one, and I love that, Nisha, talking to lawyers is what steered me away from law school. I do. I have a personal board of advisors. My wife's on it. I have a really good friend on it. And then, I may tap into one or two other people, depending on the particular important decision that might be in front of me. Right? I saw some of you folks saying you don't have a personal board, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but maybe think about it. Right? Think about having a group that you'll utilize. So, this is different than maybe just having that group that you want to vent to, right? That you're stuck in a particular situation and you just need to get certain feelings off of your chest. What I'm really talking about are people who can assist you in making an important decision, right? That's what I mean by a board of advisors, right? Because that's how a nonprofit board, that's how they would use experts, is they need to figure out the way forward in any particular situation. And they may not have the required expertise, right? They wouldn't, a board of directors wouldn't necessarily try and figure out a situation related to antitrust on their own. Let's go get an attorney to help us out with that, right? A board of directors wouldn't necessarily try and figure out what's the best, software platform to use for our membership, right? They would go ask people that are familiar with software platforms, right? So let's do that for ourselves, right? When we have important decisions, let's talk to a couple of people who are more knowledgeable in that area than us. Yeah, Brenda, I think that's a really great suggestion, is to go to colleagues in similar positions at different organizations. And, our ASA community, that's a great resource to be able to do that. In Collaborate, or if you go to any of the conferences or even some of the local events here in the DC metro area, that is a really great place to initiate or cultivate those relationships, and those folks can really be helpful. And I even do that with some of the attorneys that I work with in the same space. Okay, Rule 9. So Rule 9 is delegation. Okay. In many nonprofit organizations, you may not have staff, right? So it's really the board that is responsible for some of the critical and important work. Okay. In those situations, delegation is about spreading out that work and not taking it all on as the chair or as the treasurer or as the secretary or as the, the officers. Now we tend to think that having that particular role brings more responsibility. And in some cases, that's true. However, every director on the board has the same duty of care. They have the same duty of obedience. They have the same duty of loyalty. Okay? So when it comes to liability, there's not going to be too much distinction. So, try not to burden yourself with all of the responsibility and learn how to delegate. Okay. When you have staff, then it's a little bit different in that now the board's role is really more of just a strategic role. Okay. If you have staff, all of the tactical work should go to staff, right? And the board should be doing the things that the board is responsible for from a strategic perspective. Now, how do we apply this to everyday living? Again, took me many, many years to learn this, is learn how to ask for help. Right? That you'll see a lot of these rules, they sort of fall in line with each other. Going back to our rule, asking experts, this is almost in the same, in the same vein, is learn how to ask for help. Okay, learn how to leverage others to accomplish your goals. So I talked about the board of advisors. Well, maybe there's a particular situation that comes up where I just don't see I don't see a way forward that makes sense to me. Right? So use your board, okay? Say, let them do the thinking for you. Right? Delegate that that sense of frustration, delegate that to somebody else. Right? Let them noodle over it for a little bit. I saw a couple comments in chat about sort of this being an issue for a lot of folks, and please, feel free to speak up so that folks know that they're not alone in trying to figure out how to be better in this area. This is one of those things where I think if you truly learn how to apply this more, you're going to reap a lot of benefits for yourself personally. Sarah says, I'm a great delegator. Okay, Amy says, I've struggled with this, but I've come on board with they need a paycheck too. That's good. Yes, please spread the wealth if you can. Okay, I see a lot of folks saying delegation is a particular challenge, and I know for me it's been a challenge, but I'm getting better at it, I think. All right, so our last rule for today, and again, this is one that I think is super important. So along with the rule related to confidentiality, this is one that I hope if you haven't adopted, that you consider adopting, and that you'll promote to those around you you care about. So Rule 10 is about having civil discourse. And the reason we need civil discourse on a board is so that we can keep moving things forward, right? We need to have decisions made, and we need to make them in the most efficient way possible. Well, what does this mean for us on a daily basis? Okay, these are my words. Feel free to use your own words when applying this to yourself or promoting this rule to others. But I like to think of civil discourse as discussing and advocating passionately without discounting other perspectives. Listening with intention, waiting for others to finish speaking. I have a real good friend. His name is Scott, and we were talking last night, and he's really good. He's really good about being intentional, listening with intention. So we were talking, and we were talking about some of the challenges that we see in society, and I said I have 2 points to make, and I made my first point, and then we sort of had a discussion about that. And then after we were finished, he said, you mentioned you have a second point. I really want to hear what that was, right? That's somebody that's listening with intention. Okay, and I see a lot of great examples of what you've encountered in either your professional or personal life that really makes it hard to have a civil discourse. Mary says not listening, sticking to an agenda. Diana says using way too many words to get to a point. Yes. Deborah says taking over the conversation. Susan says not allowing a person to make their point. Yes. Yes, and we're not going to be perfect when it comes to, particularly if we're passionate about a particular point or an opinion or something else. But as much as you can, let's try and remember, let's have civil discourse when we interact with each other. Okay, so just to recap, I'm going to go back. So rule number 1 is the duty of care. That's informed decision making. Rule number 2, duty of loyalty. That's acting in the best interests of the organization or of the collective body. Rule 3, the duty of obedience is respecting our non-negotiable principles and adhering to them. Rule 4, the business judgment rule, which for us means, making mistakes in good faith and not holding ourselves responsible for those mistakes. Rule 5 was conflicts of interest. So being aware of all the competing interests and the decisions that we're making and recognizing your own bias that's going into that decision-making process. Rule 6, for me, the most important rule, okay, protecting confidential information that's been shared with you. Rule 7, private inurement, not being the I in team, although there is an ME, in team. Rule 8, leveraging those people around you that have expertise and perspective to give. Creating a board of advisors. Rule 9, delegating. Okay, you don't have to, we don't walk this life alone, right? It's actually more fun, right? It's more fun to do things with others. Okay, ask for help, leverage others. And then rule 10, civil discourse. Okay, be passionate, but listen with intention. All right, so I'm going to open it up here to see if we have any questions from today's content or anything else. Angela, thank you. I appreciate that. Nisha, so Nisha asks, how do you gently steer others to practice this rules? So, one thing I would say is, while it makes sense for our presentation today, and because we're all sort of familiar with the subject matter, I wouldn't necessarily present them all together, right? You might just pick one or two, maybe, the ones you think could be most applicable to what you want to espouse. Because one of the things I think that you can do when steering people is show it in yourself, right? Show how you actually use these rules yourself, and then that would, in from what I've experienced, that seems to make the message to whoever you're trying to communicate. That makes the message a little bit more uh, easier to accept. Okay, Susan asks, how do you deal with an executive director that violates these types of rules? Yeah, so Susan, that's a really good question. So if you're on the board, right, one thing you could suggest as a best practice is really there ought to be regular training, right? There ought to be regular training for both board and staff when it comes to best practices and conduct, right? If you're on staff, this can be a little bit more difficult. And one way I've seen it potentially addressed is to see if staff would be open to 360 assessments. But yes, I mean, Susan, it's a very, very difficult situation when you have when you have the executive director or the CEO or any senior leader violate some of these principles. And I'm sorry if I don't have a better answer for you. It's that particular situation is really tough, and sometimes there's not an easy way to deal with it. Yeah. Any other questions?